This is part 4 of the Mark highlight read. First, a condensed summation looking at the chapters overall. For part 4, chapters 14 through 16, we get the ending of Holy Week over the first half, as well as tacked on text at the end. See what I mean when we get chapter 14, which is much longer than all the other chapters. Its first part is mostly about the betrayal. Verses 1 to 2, chief priests and scribes plot to arrest and kill Jesus, but to do so not during the Passover, since doing it during a holiday, especially such a huge one, it's basically like their Christmas, would be a massive issue, causing massive uprising. Next, verses 3 to 9, at Simon the former leper's house, because wouldn't have had leprosy anymore by then, used to be a leper. At his house in Bethany, a woman anoints Jesus with pure nard, which is an incredibly expensive ointment or perfume. And she's then rebuked for what to them looks like wasting of incredibly expensive things. And he says that what she did will be proclaimed everywhere along with the gospel. Now, this is the same account of Jesus being anointed by the woman as described in Matthew, but this is the third instance of Jesus being anointed by a woman. In John, it's recorded that Martha's sister Mary did it earlier, the day before, before Palm Sunday, and then Luke records another instance that was even earlier than that of a woman doing this. Yeah, it seems like they're contradictory accounts, but they're just three different occasions, which kind of makes sense. There's no reason to believe that this wouldn't happen multiple times and that similar things would transpire each time. Especially even makes more sense when you're like me and thinks that the Matthew and Mark account, the woman who did it then, was Martha's sister Mary again, because if she did it the first time, why wouldn't she do it another time? And to get the same response, since the disciples tend to not get it the first time. Though some say that the Matthew and Mark account are the same as John, most likely not. Again, I think that it's just Mary, Martha's sister, that is doing it again and getting the same result. Next, verses 10 to 11, Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests to tell them that he'll betray Jesus for them. Then they make him an offer he can't refuse, like he was going to refuse one, and then starts seeking an opportunity to gain his reward. And finally, verses 12 to 21, Jesus instructs the disciples to prepare for Passover by telling a man carrying a water jar, a man that they come across like this, about them needing to prepare for Passover, and then the man will show them an upstairs room, which is referred to as the upper room. And then after all the preparation and the beginning of the Passover meal, Jesus reveals that he'll be betrayed, and each of the 12 ask if it's them who will do so, and Jesus says it's the one dipping bread in the dish with him, which probably isn't him saying that whoever is doing this at this very moment, it's him who's doing that in this present time, which can all have during the time of this meal. And Jesus says that woe to him to who will betray him, so much woe that he'll wish he was never born. Dang. The second part of this very long chapter is also mostly about the betrayal. But first, verses 22 to 25, Jesus institutes communion, and he says right there in front of them before the crucifixion that the bread is his body and the wine is his blood. So those things are clearly, obviously metaphors. And then verses 26 to 31, Jesus says that when he's arrested, they'll all scatter. Peter denies that and is then told by Jesus that he will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. Twice, that is. Now, other accounts like Matthew's does not say twice, but it's because he found the first crow irrelevant, since it didn't matter until there was a second crow. And he didn't say only crow once. So it's not, so again, this is not a contradiction. It's just Matthew saw it as an unnecessary detail because he thought, I could say two, but why? Do I need to say two? Let's mess anybody up if I don't. No? Okay then. Next, verses 32 to 42. The group goes to Gethsemane, where Jesus prays 3 times to not have to go through what he'll have to go through, and says to God, his Abba Father, if you can do all things, so if you will to do this, please do it. Please let me not have to go through this. And God did not will for that. So then, and Peter is found sleeping on the watch. And then after the third prayer, Judas Iscariot, along with the crowd, arrives to arrest Jesus. And then verses 43 to 50, Judas Iscariot gives the signal to the arresting officers which one is Jesus. A disciple who is named as Peter in another account cuts off a high priest's servant's ear. Jesus questions, why with all the weapons? When he has never been known for being a violent criminal, unless you want to count when he got ticked off in the temple. But besides that, he's been fairly peaceful, so the weapons seem unnecessary. And he is then taken, and the rest flee, as predicted. And the final part of this long chapter, after the betrayal, is more about trial and denial. The first verses 51 to 52, we probably get the funniest paragraph in all of Scripture, at least to me, where it describes, seemingly totally out of pocket, out of nowhere, for no reason, a young man who is in what would be like a bathrobe or lounge robe, slipping out of it after being grabbed, and then running away naked. I tell you, this cracks me up every time. And because only in Mark's gospel, not even in any of the other gospels, is this written, and because it seems so totally pointless and out of nowhere, it is speculated that the young man is Mark himself, and that maybe he kept it anonymous because thought he put it in there, but didn't think he'd take the humiliation himself. Now, obviously, we cannot say for certain, or even to be sure, that is or isn't Mark. I personally think it is, but would not at all be surprised if it isn't. And how the idea of how it could be Mark goes is that it's believed the upper room they were in was his mother's house. So, maybe it went something like, while they were there, Mark was there too, and maybe he had just gone to bed or was in the bath, heard everybody leaving to go to Gethsemane, threw on, again, what would be like a lounge or a bathrobe to us today, and, ran after him and followed them, going, hey, what up? I want to see what's happening. And so then when all this transpires, he runs away. And he apparently does the lizard losing his tail tactic with his robe. It cracks me up every time. You need a good laugh, read those 2 verses. If it doesn't make you laugh, I'm sorry for you. So next, verses 53 to 65, we get back to the serious stuff. We get back from Mark's comic relief. Jesus was led to the Sanhedrin, which is like the council of all the religious authorities, all the Judaism authorities. Led there with Peter secretly following. And while Jesus is there before the council, the Sanhedrin, many testimonies, which are either false and or contradicting, are heard. Jesus gives his only answer, which is to the question of, are you the Christ, Son of God? By saying, yes, that he is, and that they'll see him at God's right hand in heaven. Of course, they get immensely ticked off at this, so much so that the high priest actually tears his robe in anger. I typed calls, but really yells for a decision. And then they start striking Jesus, spitting on him, and mocking him, like saying, "Prophesy, come on!" And then hand him, bloodied and beaten, over to their guards. And then finally, to wrap up this chapter, verses 66 to 72. Meanwhile, in the outer court, while the previous passage was happening, a high priest servant, seeing Peter warming up by the hobo fire, says that he was definitely with Jesus. Peter denies this, saying that he doesn't even understand what she's talking about. I don't know what you mean. He then goes off towards the gateway of the outer court and hears a rooster crow during that, which that's only the first time, and just felt like felt like useless to write in for Matthew, so hence why it's not mentioned. And then the same girl repeats her statement, or more rephrasing it, to bystanders, and then Peter denies it again. The other accounts make it sound like it's somebody else who says something about Peter being with Jesus, and then Peter denies it. And it doesn't say that it's the same girl. Easily what happened is that multiple people, including her, between the first and second denial by Peter, were saying that he was definitely with Jesus, that he's one of his followers. Very easy that would have happened, because, Peter is the most high-profile disciple, and Jesus is an incredibly high-profile guy. Makes sense that a lot of people would see his face and be like, "Oh, that's the guy." And for multiple people to be saying that at once, between denials. And then later, bystanders say that Peter must have definitely been one of the followers because he's a Galilean, and got a lot of Galileans in Jerusalem at that time. Which makes sense since Galilee is so far north from there. No, it's your accent betrays you. And then Peter denies for the third time and also invokes a curse and swears. And then the rooster crows again. And Peter remembers what Jesus said and starts weeping. Chapter 15, the first part of it is about Good Friday, verses 1 through 5. Jesus is given over to Pilate and answers, "You said so," when Pilate asks him if he's the king of the Jews, and then doesn't give any other reply to anything else Pilate says, which then amazes him. Next, verses 6 to 15. Pilate offers to release the insurrectionist murderer Barabbas or Jesus, which was customary at the time when this happened. And the chief priests get the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate hands them over so that this is so. Next, verses 16 to 20, at the Praetorium, which is basically the governor's headquarters, kind of. The soldiers mock Jesus by putting a purple cloak. Now, like in Matthew, it says a scarlet cloak. There's an easy answer in this, and I'm pretty sure it's not the Wells burgundy, so it was red, violet answer. It's probably more these are different cloaks put on at different times. Because from when Jesus is given over to soldiers to when he is led away to be crucified is actually a lot more time than the writing makes it seem. So they put that on him along with a crown of thorns to mock him, and as well as insincerely kneeling and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and then they begin striking him. The rest of the chapter continues with Good Friday and goes into Black Saturday by going over the execution and burial. Verses 21 to 32, Rufus's and Alex's dad Simon of Cyrene. Mark decided to put that Simon of Cyrene is these two men's dad because I guess they're well known to his audience. He was forced to carry Jesus' cross for him. And then Jesus is offered myrrh mixed wine, but doesn't take it because in Matthew's account, he said he wouldn't drink of wine till the deed is done. And Matthew also says that bile was also mixed into the wine, which is why it was so sour. Then Jesus has his clothes gambled for and is crucified at a 9 a.m., which Mark puts down using Jewish timekeeping. And this happens to him with the charge plaqued over his head that reads Jesus of Nazareth, which that part is left out by Mark because, save ink if your audience knows who you're talking about. And then continues, King of the Jews. With that over his head, and then on either side of him, there is a robber crucified. And then he is mocked and as people shake their heads at him. Next, verses 33 to 41, Jesus quotes Psalm 21 in Aramaic. That is what he's doing when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which to those who didn't understand Aramaic were thinking that he was calling for Elijah and said, hey, he's calling for Elijah. Well, let's see if he shows up. So mocks him with that. And after this, Jesus breathes his last breath, which astonishes a nearby onlooking centurion who says he was the son of, or at least a son of, God. And Salome, Mary Magdalene, Mary who's called in this verse mother of James the Younger and Joseph. This Mary is probably one that hasn't been described any earlier, meaning not Jesus' mother. And she probably isn't the mother of the lesser known disciple named James, because this would be the only time he is ever referred to as the younger and as having a brother named Joseph. This is probably just some other Mary who's the mother of some other James and some other Joseph. Those three women, along with other women who had been following Jesus, watched as his spirit left him. And then finally, verses 42 to 47, the Sanhedrin member named Joseph, who is from Arimathea, and was actually pro-Jesus. Him and Nicodemus were the only ones who were. Request for Jesus' body from Pilate, who calls over a centurion to make sure that Jesus actually is dead, because most crucifixions didn't have a dead guy that fast, but, they didn't include having a crown of thorns jammed on his head and all the other beatings. And after the centurion says, yes, he is dead, Pilate gives the body over, and Joseph wraps up the body, puts it in a cut out of a rock tomb, and rolls a huge stone against the entrance with the before mentioned Mary's watching. Chapter 16, the first part of it is what is definitely scripture that exists in the oldest manuscripts. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll understand the next slide. Verses 1 to 8, which are the only ones in the oldest manuscripts, say that the three before mentioned women, Mary, and Salome, head to the tomb, and then when they get there, they see that the stone has been moved after discussing amongst themselves, who the heck are we going to get to move this for us? And they also see a man sitting on the right, air quote man, because it's really an angel. And he says, don't be afraid, which I guess is the opening line for every angel to say. Read every account where an angel appears. Just about every last one of them says this. And then he also says, Jesus has risen, and to go tell his disciples that he's going before them to Galilee. And then they run to go do so, full of terrified, speechless awe, which is one of the many instances Mark wrote of people being astonished about Jesus, and is what he felt was a good end. Now, the rest of the chapter probably isn't scripture because it doesn't seem to be original text, since we can't find it in our oldest manuscripts. And Wes Huff goes over this in his video I have linked in the description. Likely what happened is a few centuries later, some guy had a copy of Mark, thought the ending was a little chopped off, even though it ended with astonishment, which was a theme for Mark. But this guy felt it was chopped off, so he added content from the other gospel accounts to give what he thought was a completed conclusion. So we shouldn't treat this like scripture and put it on the same authoritative level, but it doesn't mean we can't read it. Verses 9 through 11, we get that Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, whom he casts 7 demons out of, and she tells the mourning disciples what occurred, which this is another account, so we know that's true. Verses 12 to 13, Jesus appears to 2 of his followers traveling down a road in a hidden form, meaning that for whatever supernatural reason, they can't tell that it's him. And then finally, when they're allowed to be able to tell who he is, they go and tell the others who disbelieve them. And this is in Luke's Road to Emmaus account, so we know that's true. Then finally, verses 14 through 20, Jesus appears to the 11 during a meal, rebukes their disbelief, gives the Great Commission, lists signs that will accompany their preaching, and ascends, and then the disciples go out and minister. And this stuff comes from other gospel accounts too, so we know it's true. But a couple things with verse 16. It's not saying that water baptism is required for salvation like some people think, because one, there are 2 kinds of baptism. There's water baptism, and then there's baptism in the Spirit, like John the Baptizer talked about earlier in Mark. And second, with verse 16, it only says that those who don't believe are condemned, and it doesn't include that those who aren't water baptized, so that verse is not saying you must be water baptized to be saved. And again, this is tacked on text, not authoritative scripture, so it wouldn't really even matter if it did. And then verse 18, serpent grabbing and poison drinking and only appear in this text. So they're not certainly true, like certainly things that will accompany their preaching. But everything else in the text comes from some of the other accounts. Now, I'm going to do a quick sidebar on this book, because it's recorded on a great number of occasions that Jesus told someone not to say something that seemed ridiculous not to be told, like telling many people he healed to not tell anyone that they were healed, and like telling Peter not to tell anyone that he knows he's the Christ. It all seems ridiculous. Well, why Jesus did this is because it was all about timing. You see, he wasn't supposed to be the time-splitting, BC and AD, most famous person in all of human existence forever, and proclaimed to all the world until after he had completed the first coming, until the first coming was over. See, if even before Holy Week, Jesus was as well known in the Roman Empire, or at least the greater Middle East and parts of Europe, well known in their regions, in those areas then as he is now, it would have thrown everything off. Because he was supposed to be this seemingly average guy who had a humble ministry, greatly impacting, yet still to a level humble ministry, because he was to be the humble servant. And then show God's greatest act of love through the atonement, and then have that proclaimed and known about him throughout all the world, be the primary thing known about him by everyone. Now in this video, with some key verses from these chapters. 14:36 says, "And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." 15:2 says, "And Pilate asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, You have said so." And 16:6 says, "And he said to them, Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him."